We are continuing our study through the book of Philippians. I started preaching in July from the book of Philippians and thought I would be finished. I'm still in chapter 1. Amen. Last week I started a sermon called Looking at Life in 3C Glasses. I'm still getting an echo. I need you to get that for me. In 3C glasses, not 3D, but it's my conviction that your perception, that your outlook will determine your outcome. And I began by telling you last week, as we looked at verses 12 through 20, that God uses your condition to embolden you. God will use your conviction, your condition, wherever it is, to evangelize non-believers, and God will use your condition to empower other believers. And now in verses 21 through verse 30, I want to look at life through 3C glasses, part 2. Look with me, won't you? The book of Philippians, first chapter. I'm going to be reading from the King James Version. I like the wording of the King James. Hear the apostle as he says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor, yet what shall I choose? I wot not. For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again. Only let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ, that whether I come and see you or else be absent, I may hear of your affairs, that ye stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and in nothing terrified by your adversaries, which is to them an evident token of perdition, but to you of salvation and that of God. For unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake, having the same conflict which ye saw in me, and now here to be in me. The grass withers and the flowers thereof fade away, but the word of our God shall stand forever." You may be seated. Paul continues this pastoral love letter between a pastor and a church. Remember now, he's in Rome, almost 700 miles away, while they are in Philippi. He is writing this love letter about joy and saying to them, I'm in a fix, but don't let my fix affect your faith. Thank you, ushers. You may be seated. He says to them, earlier on, he was sharing with them about his conviction, how he saw what he was going through. And now Paul speaks to them about his present condition. I like this text because Paul begins this text, first of all, by giving a personal explanation. You can walk right along here with me. He gives a word about his personal condition. I'm in jail, but Paul says, let me tell you two things about me real quick. His personal condition is that I am both free and I'm victorious. Let me say that again because it looked like a shout should have followed that. Paul says, even though I'm in jail, I'm surrounded by guards 24/7. I am free and I am victorious. He says in this text, here it is, he says, Paul says, now I intend to be set free. When you read verse 20, he says, I'm going to be set free. I'm not sure if it's going to be on this side or in the side to come. He says, I'm not sure if my chains are going to be off or if I'm going to die. But either way, I am victorious and I'm free. And maybe somebody here needs to hear that word from the Lord that says to us, we are already free and we are already victorious. That we are not fighting for a victory, we're fighting from a place of victory. And it changes the way you fight when you know already that you have won. But here it is, y'all. Don't miss this. Paul says, the reason I've got this personal condition is because of my personal conviction. He drops this on them, and it may be the theme verse for the whole book. It is definitely the theme verse for the chapter. He says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. A better rendering of the Greek is that he raises that question, what is life to me? What is life all about? What does life mean? If you need an explanation of what my life is, he said, in one word, my life is Christ. Now here is a word, and don't miss this. Paul says, my position is this, that if I live, it's for Christ, but if I die, this word in the Greek gain is really it's a term, it's a mathematical term, which means more of the same. He says, if I live, what is life to me? Jesus. But if I die, I go where Jesus is and I get more of Jesus. So Paul says, he must have been watching one of those insurance commercials. Paul says, it's a win-win for me, because if I live, I'm going to live to give Christ glory. But if I die, I get to go be in his glory. His explanation of life is Jesus Christ. Now here, let me be a blessing to somebody up in here. When Christ is your reason for living, it helps you to handle whatever happens in your life. That's why if getting stuff is your reason for living, when you can't get stuff, you try to kill yourself. That's why when being liked is your reason for living, when folks stop liking you, you lose your mind. I don't need everybody, but I wish I had about 7 people in here who were feeling some Christ today. I told you in Philippians, Paul is a Christ addict. He is so hooked on Christ, he said he is the purpose for my life. And he says, if I lose everything else and I still got Jesus, I'm going to make it. Y'all, here is one of the hardest realities I've ever had to learn in life. I had to learn it, and listen, it is a difficult lesson. If you are here, get this, don't miss this. If you are here and you don't have it, it means you don't need it to be here. God may have used it or them to get you here. But if you are here and they are not here, it means you can make it without them. 2 days ago, I commemorated the second year of my father's dying. My father and I are real close. If you look at me, you see what my daddy looked like 40 years ago. And I mean, I am his son. I didn't have to go on Maury. He is the father. My daddy is dead. I preached his funeral. I was by his side the last, but I am here. If my daddy is here, that means I don't need him. Lord, deliver me from believers who think you can't live without mama or daddy. You can't live without your husband or your wife. You can't live. Paul says, for me to live is Christ. I love my daddy, but my daddy's time was over. He had to go. And the fact that God has kept me here and took my daddy means that I only need Jesus to keep on keeping on. Lord, Pastor, I don't know what I'm going to do. What did you do before? Somebody ought to help me here. You got to learn how to trust him. That means that if my health isn't what it was, I still got Jesus. That means if my finances are not what they were, I still got Jesus. That means if my circle of friends is smaller, I still got Jesus. He says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now that was his personal conviction and his personal condition, but he has a personal conflict. It's in the text. I'm not making it up. Paul is writing to the church, and he says to the church, he says, now, y'all, to be honest, I like this wording of the King James. I'm betwixt. Next time you're talking, just drop that in. You know, here's my conflict. I'm betwixt the two. Paul says, I want to go where Jesus is. He says, but left up to me, it would be better for me to go to see Jesus, but you need me here to stay and be fruitful. So what Paul says to the church here at Philippi is, I've decided to stay with you for your benefit, because if I stay here, I'm going to be fruitful, but if I go where Jesus is, I'm going to experience fulfillment. That's a shot right there. Listen. He says, I want to stay here so I can keep telling you about Jesus. But when I go where he is, won't be nobody telling me about him, because we'll see him for ourselves. I want to stay here so I can talk to you about the Lord. But when I die, I'm going to go talk to the Lord. So he says, I'm doing you a favor. Now, I must admit that one of the great arguments against the Christian faith has been that Christianity is somewhat, I think the term they use is nihilistic, in that it encourages an organism to die by saying that death is better. Friedrich Nietzsche, who died in 1900, I think about August 20th, used to have said that Christianity was no longer necessary because God is dead. He said that we had reached a point where we no longer need God. But I want to push back at Mr. Nietzsche and say that Christianity does not encourage an organism to die. Christianity acknowledges that one day we got to die, and Christianity says when we die, that's not going to be over, because we got somebody, in the words of my big mama, to meet us when we in the Jordan River in that dying room. I want to say to Nietzsche, who suggested that we'd reached a point, y'all, that we are so smart we no longer need God. Man doesn't need God. And Nietzsche would declare that God is dead. Well, nobody has heard from Nietzsche since 1900. I want to say to Nietzsche, I talked to God this morning. Preach, Delvin, Atchison. I'm doing the best I can. I'm doing the best I can. And so since Paul says, I know death is a reality, it is not a frightening one, and because I've already conquered it, I can handle it. A doctor, back in the days when doctors would make home visits, a doctor was making his round. He had made his round. He'd gone to one of his patients and had to tell his patient that death was imminent. He says, yes, this is what it looks like. In all likelihood, this is how long. The patient looked at the doctor and said, Doctor, do you believe in the afterlife? He says, I do. He says, well, what do you think about death? The doctor said, that noise you've been hearing out on your porch scratching, that's my dog. He says, my dog has never been in your house. He's never been in this room. But if I were to call him now, he would quickly come. And the reason he would come is because he knows his master's voice. And he knows how his master takes care of him. And he knows that even though he's not been in this room, if the master is in here, it's going to be all right. Insert shout right here. I don't know what's beyond the veil. I don't know what's beyond the darkness of death. But this I do know. I know my master's voice. And when he calls me, I'm going where he is. But then, Paul just doesn't give a personal explanation. He gives some pastoral expectations. It's right here in the text. You see, when he gives his personal explanation, he says, this is where I am, this is what's going on. And now he says, this is what I expect of you. I wanted to shout when I read this text, y'all, because Paul says three things real quick. He says three things about where they ought to be. He starts off talking about the fellowship. You got your Bibles? Yeah. Look in verse 5. He talks about the fellowship of the gospel in verse 5. So what Paul says to them is, you are citizens that as believers, when you became believers, you became citizens, there's certain heirs. He literally says that you and I are siblings. We are brothers and sisters. We are in the fellowship of the gospel. When you became a believer, there are certain things that you became heir to when you became a citizen. And you and I are brothers and sisters. And he says to them that as the pastor, I expect for you to act like family. Certain things family can call on. We are in fellowship. This idea of the fellowship, it comes from a word which means to have all things in common, that we share each other's load. But he says you ought to grow from just fellowship. He says you start off understanding that you just don't have rights in this community, but you got responsibilities to this community. You look like you don't believe me. In verse 25, he says, the furtherance of the gospel. So he moves from the fellowship where you're just a citizen to where he talks about you're furthering the gospel, which means now you're a carrier. You're not just siblings, but you are servants. That you have a responsibility of sharing the gospel that you have heard. Now watch this, y'all. Don't miss this, because Paul says that as a pastor, I expect for you to grow. I'm not just looking for you to grow old. I'm looking for you to grow up. Because when you understand that you're a citizen, that means there are certain things that I get. But when I start to share the gospel, there are certain things that I'm carrying. I'm not just a citizen, I'm a carrier. I'm not just in the fellowship, I'm in the furtherance. I'm not just a sibling, but now I'm a servant. I'm carrying it. But then, y'all, here it is. Here's where I wanted to shout. When he got to verse 27, he talks about the faith of the gospel. So he moves from the fellowship to the furtherance to the faith of the gospel. He says that we are not just citizens of the gospel, and we are not just servants, but now we ought to be soldiers. He says, I don't want you just to be a citizen or a contender, a carrier. I want you, he says that you ought to grow up. Now you are fighting for the gospel. That those of us who are Christians, here it is, here's the shout. Here's why all those fans, he says, listen, you don't just stay around here and eat all the time. You don't just stay around here and shout all the time and never grow. My daughter is here, and when she was born, the first time she said goo goo, da da, she said da da. I thought, oh my God. I was telling her, oh, this baby is Einstein. You know how smart this baby is to know how much. She ain't no baby no more. If she come say da da now, I'm gonna have a check. I remember the first time I changed a diaper. I was the proudest dad in the world. Yo, I did that thing. Oh my God. And I just didn't put the pamper in the trash. I took it outside. Look out there now. If I had to change her now, there would be a problem. Here it is. What we shout about in babies, we would be ashamed of in adults. So that 10 years ago when you were a member, you acted this way. We said we understood because you just got here. But grown folk ought not act that way. He literally uses this term, and one of the reasons I wanted the King James is he says that your conversation, and what is interesting in Scripture is that there is nowhere in Scripture where the word conversation refers to oral communication between two individuals. Conversation means your lifestyle. Paul says your lifestyle ought to be one that is becoming of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Yes, you are grown enough to do whatever you want to, but your actions have consequences, and you owe it to the gospel to act like a believer. Listen. This is, I tell people, this is early enough. This is far enough away from my anniversary so you can get mad and you'll be loving me again by then. I'm sick of having to compliment grown folk for doing what grown folk ought to do. Let me tell you, you don't get any points with me. Let me tell you, brother, you don't get any points with me when you tell me about you and your wife, if you and your wife separate, and you say, well, you know I pay child support. You're supposed to. You don't get any trophies for that. When you're not at church, you're supposed to pay your tithes. There are things you're supposed to do as a believer. Your conversation, and it is not to Westside, it is to Jesus Christ. And those of us who serve here at Westside, we have an obligation to make sure that the folk who serve with us do it according to the gospel of Jesus Christ. He says in a nutshell, he says, grow up. It's not just enough for us to grow old in the Lord or to grow out in the Lord. We ought to grow up in the Lord. I keep telling people there ought to be some stuff you just ought to see. If you're not, listen, if you've been walking with the Lord 20, 30 years, if you're not doing it less often, you ought to at least feel more guilty about doing it. I mean, come on, help me now. Come on, help me. If folk would make you fight, I mean, you know, if they said what they said would make you fight them, you ought to be able to look and cuss under your breath and then move on now. Come on, talk. Am I right? If the devil ought not be getting you with the same tricks 20 years later. I ought to be able to look at you and say you've grown a little bit in the Lord. It's time for us. That's what Paul says. I have an expectation. And Paul says it like this: you ought not do it just because you're afraid I'm going to catch you. He says, whether I am here or I am absent, you ought to grow up. Lord, deliver me. If the only reason you are doing what you're doing is because you're afraid of what Pastor Atchison is going to say. No. You ought to do it for the Lord, because I need to tell you, sometimes I get sick of you. Jesus will tolerate you. Oh, come on, somebody help me. You don't do it for me because I didn't take a nail in my hand for you. Don't do it for me. I don't talk to God every night interceding on your behalf. It wasn't my Holy Spirit I sent to it. You owe it to Jesus, who Friday went to Calvary for you. Well, let me finish. He gives his personal explanation. This is where I am. He gives a pastoral expectation, but he concludes with a powerful exhortation. It's in the text. I'm not even making it up. He says, here's why. He says, now I'm in jail. I'm going to die, and if I don't, I'll come see you. If I get out, I'm coming to see you, but if I don't. He says, but this is what ought to hold you while you're going through. It's right here in the text. He says that you and I ought to have the courage of unity. He says you are not by yourself. He says stand, the sameness of mind, the sameness of spirit, and it just means something, y'all. That's why I tell people why you ought to be a part of a church. That's why I tell people that the church you get ought not just be online, that I need to have a place where I can go that when I'm sick, I know somebody cares. It matters to have somebody. I tell people, God does in church is you and I have got some rough spots, and y'all, we bump into each other and we help to smooth each other. But it means something when you got somebody with you. When I was growing up, y'all, I was real thin and I was real small. But now I know you won't believe this about me, but I had a smart mouth growing up. My friend Delvin Mack said I was so smart growing up that they thought I was going to be smart alecky. But so I couldn't let anybody cap on me or high side or talk about me, and I didn't talk back. I mean, I had to talk back. You just didn't get away with saying stuff about me. I mean, I know you don't believe that about me now. But sometimes you get in fights, and I just told you I wasn't big, I couldn't fight. So sometimes I had to back up all that old smart talk. I had to back up from it. But I have a brother whose name is Colester, and my brother is cut. He's swole. So when my brother would be there, what I would back up from, he would back up for me. So if you want to see me talk that talk, you let my big brother show up. Oh, yeah. And we would play the dozens. Yeah, I'm talking about yo mama. Yo. Come on. I know I'm not the only one. Because when my brother got there, I was bad. I fooled around talking about your grandmama. But my brother was there. What Paul says to us is you need to be unified, because you and I, we have the courage of unity. We got each other to back us up. I don't have to be afraid because I got some other family members here who got my back. He talks about us facing the enemy, but I got some folk. I don't need everybody. But I wish I had somebody up here who can testify and say, I got your back. That when you go against the devil, I got your back. When members of our church are having surgery, just go to the waiting room and see. Look at the folk who are there. You're not by yourself. We're with you. When they have to stand by graves, you're not by yourself. We are with you. When your child is in trouble, you are not by yourself. We are with you. There is the courage of unity. But then he says a word about the confidence of victory. He says you're going against the adversary, but don't be afraid, because you've already won. We are victorious. You're going to win in the end. And when you know you're going to win, you'll take some chances. When you already know you're going to win, you can stand boldly. He says you're going to win. Now, I don't know who I'm talking to, because it may look dark where you are. It may look difficult where you are, but I stop by to tell you, victory is already ours. Victory is ours. We are already assured of the victory. I already know that I've won. I had to tell a guy who was a Jehovah's Witness, and he was asking me, how do you know that you're already saved? How do you know that you've already won a contest that you're in? And I told him, I said, my brother, have you ever watched baseball? He said, yes. I said, have you ever seen anybody hit a home run? He said, yes, I've seen him hit a home run. I said, well, you tell me this. Why is he running the bases when the score has already changed to 1? He can't be put out. So why does he have to run the bases? I said, that's what we do as believers at Calvary. Jesus hit a home run. I've got to run around first and second and third, but after a while, I'm coming home. I already know I've won. I'm getting out of here. He says a word about the courage and the confidence. But finally, he says a word about the comfort for our struggling. He says you ought to consider yourself blessed. Consider yourself blessed, because he says we have already won the victory. And you and I know that God has picked us to suffer. And y'all, if you want a reason to shout, I'm going to give you one right now. It is, I am excited that God feels like he can trust me. That means that whatever I'm going through in life, I want that he can always trust me. I may be up sometime and I may be down sometime, but he can trust me. That means through the storms and through the rains, he can trust me. Because the good thing I know is that it won't always be like this. I'm going to my seat, but can I close by giving you what I call my hillbilly theology? I want to tell a little story about a man named Jed. He was a poor mountaineer. He barely kept his family fed. But then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground came a bubbling crude. Oil, that is black gold Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed's a millionaire. The kinfolk said, Jed, let's move away from here. Said, California is the place you ought to be. So he loaded up the truck and he moved to Beverly Hills, that is swimming pools and movie stars. Well, let me tell you my hillbilly theology. Jed was doing pretty good where he was, but when he discovered oil, he figured after a while he'd be doing a little bit better. After a while, he'd leave his old cabin and he'd move to a big old mansion. After a while, he'd have to change his address when he moved to his brand new house. After a while, he'd have a cement pond instead of fishing in the old tank. After a while, he'd have brand new neighbors like Mr. Drysdale. Well, I got a few more risings and settings of the sun. One of these old days, a little by and by, I'm going to leave the home I'm in now, and I'm going to move to streets of gold. When I get to heaven, I got a brand new mansion. When I get to heaven, there'll be a crystal fountain. When I get to heaven, I got brand new neighbors. John the Baptist will live on the corner. David the psalmist is gonna live next door. But when I get to heaven, I'm gonna get to see my Jesus. Is there anybody here that's gonna hold on till your change come? Anybody here gonna make it a little while longer? Anybody here gonna suffer for the kingdom? Anybody here wanna walk down streets of gold? Anybody here that know my Jesus? Ain't he all right? I said, ain't he all right? Ain't he all right? I'm sorry, I forgot we were in the abridged version, because if we were in regular worship, I tell you what I'd do. If we were in regular worship, I'd say, is there anybody here that know the man is all right? Anybody here that tried the Lord? Well, if you know he's all right, can I say one thing? I know he's all right. Anybody tried him? Won't he walk with you? Anybody tried him? Won't he come see about you? Anybody ever called on him? Won't he hold your hand? Anybody couldn't see you and the Lord directed your path? Ain't he all right? Ain't he all right? Ain't he, ain't he, ain't he, ain't he? Paul says to us, hang on in there. And that word is for somebody who wants to give up. That word is for you when you want to quit. You're not fighting to win. You've already won. The victory is already yours. You've got the unity of the saints to carry you through. You've got ultimate victory. But you ought to consider yourself honored that God trusted you to suffer.